Hi, I am Roberto. This video you're about to watch is the second part of my conversation with Professor James Lamiell. The conversation is about his book from 2019, which is titled Psychology's Misuse of Statistics and Persistent Dismissal of its Critics. So, if you have not seen the first part of the interview, just go take a look at the description below and you will see the previous part. If you also don't know what the book is about, you can find my book commentary video about the topic of this book. And specifically in this part of the conversation, Professor Lamiell talks about why he characterizes psychology as incorrigible, which is, I think, quite interesting. And of course, everything relates to the topic of statisticism, which is the main topic of the book. And yeah, I mean, you can also hear Professor Lamiell talk about why statisticism is a socio-ethical problem for psychology. So it is not a tiny thing. Again, if you don't know the book, you can check my book commentary video. But anyway, if you enjoyed the first part already, I know you will enjoy these ones. So here we go.
Now, I would actually like to emphasize this point with a question going a bit ahead on one of the topics I wanted to address. Do you think philosophical thinking or methods, let's say closely related to what it stands for, do you think that is not respected enough in modern psychology?
Yes. Yes. That's my short answer. Yes. And I can't remember how much I talked about this in the book. You'd think I would remember. It's not that old, but I'm old. Wundt published a paper in 1913, Psychology Struggle for Existence. And he said, psychology and philosophy are wanting to separate. This is a bad idea because psychologists will lose capacity within their discipline to deal with conceptual questions. And in any legitimate science, conceptual questions come up. A good science and good scientists recognize that their discipline is not purely empirical. There are conceptual questions. And I know firsthand that by the time I came along, psychology had lost its interest in conceptual questions. When I published the 1981 American Psychologist article, my department chair congratulated me, and then he said, but you know, it's merely theoretical. And he used the term merely, and I think I did write about this.
It is in the book, yes.
and that's exactly what I meant. And others have written about this, and I've cited their work in the field too. It's not just Lamiell, the crank, being concerned about this. I think that psychologists first lost their interest in conceptual and philosophical questions and have since largely lost the capacity to deal with conceptual questions. And this is exactly what Wundt warned about in 1913.
Yeah.
So yes, I do think that has happened. You asked at some point why isn't the point being made, or why are psychologists sticking so to their methods? I can't find it exactly in the text, but my short answer is careerism.
Yeah. Well, this is, for example, this you do not explicitly mention careerism in your book, but this is what was in my mind the whole time, because I mean, I was wondering, okay, how real is the perspective that I think I told you at the beginning. I will not say I'm a young psychologist. I mean, I'm 30 years old, but I also I'm not the most experienced, of course. I don't know. I'm young. Yeah, career-wise, yes. But the point is, when I see these kind of discussions and you show the evidence about all of these potentially or basically major flaws in the foundations of psychology, or very, very big pitfalls in what is being done right now, yeah, you think, okay, yeah, but to a lot of colleagues, let's say, or persons that exist in the field, this might not matter, because all they want is to publish, all they want is to be cited and
get grants.
Grants, yeah, exactly. So then that also serves as at least to me, as some kind of explanation about why somebody will be like, okay, this is just trivial, let's move on.
Right. And I had, even when I was at Illinois, there were, well, maybe not at Illinois yet. Yeah, maybe, but certainly at Georgetown, graduate students whom I taught. And they would come to me in private and say, look, I know you're right, but I got to get my degree. And the work has to be done in thus and so a way. And so, sorry. But, and in all fairness, many of them, certainly earlier on more than later, were saying to me, okay, Lamiell, what should we do instead? Now, there's a pitfall there, because in many cases, what the questioner really wants to know is, how do I go about doing what I've been doing better or more correctly? Right. And the answer to that question is you can't. What you're doing is not psychology, it's demography. And you may be doing exquisite demography, and if what you want to do is demography, don't change a thing. Keep on doing what you're doing. And then when they say, well, you can't do psychology scientifically and study individuals. And as I think I might have said in the book at some point, people like Wundt, Ebbinghaus, they would have been very surprised to hear this, because that's exactly what they were doing. That's how experimental psychology began. And you asked me, well, what were they doing? What were they after? There is a place in the interview where you asked me that question. Should I take it up now or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. They were in search for experimental evidence of general laws concerning human psychological functioning. Well, Lamiell, you can't find general laws by studying individuals. But the early experimentalists, and again, this is Wundt and Ebbinghaus and their contemporaries, they understood general to mean allgemein, common to all. Common to all what? Well, their interest is in individual human beings and their consciousness or mental functioning, so common to all individuals. And then I asked my questioner the question, how would you find a law that is general across individuals without studying individuals? It's not only an option, it's necessary. If you have nothing of scientific authority after your experiment to say about individuals, and that's all you'll have if you have only aggregate statistics, how do you establish the generality of these laws? You can't establish that something is common to all individuals unless you're able of testing that question at the level of the individual, and aggregate research doesn't do that. When statistics entered into the discipline, the meaning of general changed from common to all to true on average. These are not the same meanings. They are obviously not the same meanings. And so the first step to what do you do instead, Lamiell, is get back to studying individuals. You can do this experimentally. You can do it quantitatively. In fact, you don't have to abandon quantitative methods entirely. You can, this can be done. The early experimentalists were doing it. And it's funny, Roberto, in a sad sort of way, that most general psychology textbooks, even today, will pay homage early on to Wundt and Ebbinghaus as the founders of their science, and without realizing that the experimental science they were doing was something vastly different from what has come to be the case, the treatment group approach. And statistical methods, population statistical methods, were not a part of Wundtian experimentation, and they were not a part of Ebbinghaus's work at all. Well, they were actually Ebbinghaus's work, but all the data observations on which he calculated his statistics were based on himself. That's the multiple observations of the individual. And as a matter of fact, he was interested in estimating error in the observations that he had made about himself. And that was one of the early uses of statistics in combination with measurement. So we have to learn to relearn to appreciate the fact that you can study individual persons in search of generalities within psychology, as long as you understand generality to mean common to all. So it's doable. And there are methods out there for doing work that is high quality and would pass muster as psychology that is quantitative. And we must also open up the bandwidth, our methodological bandwidth, to admit of the necessity, in addition perhaps to quantitative methods, of qualitative methods. And exercising qualitative methods is not outside the bounds of science. Certainly it would not be to anyone with an appreciation for the distinction between the Naturwissenschaften and the Geisteswissenschaften. And Windelband was critical in this. Geisteswissenschaft is basically, it would be the human sciences. And might be translated or referred to more often in English as the humanities, which is unfortunate because when you use the term humanities, the term science drops out of the name. We don't talk about the human sciences, but rather the humanities. And we tend to think of humanities as something different from science. But if you think of them in the German sense, or the original German sense, as Geisteswissenschaften, Wissenschaft, which is the name of, is a term for science. It occurs there just as it occurs in Naturwissenschaften. So we have not science and non-science, but two different kinds of science calling for different methods. And there's plenty of people out there now, not in the mainstream, but out there nonetheless, who are talking about the importance of qualitative methods in the prosecution of a scientific psychology. And I think that that's one of the things that's going to have to happen within the mainstream.
And now correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe one of your conclusions is that psychology can be both of these, right? It has these two, let's say, distinctive natures, you know, because of what you just explained, of course. And I think the part of the message of the book is that, yeah, of course, psychology, by definition, it has to do, of course, with psychology, which resides in individuals, right?
Yes,
but of course, you can do this kind of, as you have named it, also the psychodemography studies, or basically mainstream psychology, which is working with aggregated data, which can be useful, I believe you state clearly, for public policy or other type of efforts. But do not make the mistake of taking that to say that you know things about individual psychology, right? So that's the thing. That's when all these kind of topics. That's what I mean. You know, that you talk about knowledge of no one, which is what turns out to be is being generated most of the time.
That's right.
Maybe even when researchers don't recognize it. Because the original goal, or one of the goals of special experimental psychology, was general laws, right? and that's it. But they
Right.
ended up, or not they, but the followers of that ended up doing instead, getting knowledge which is average untrue for the average man, right? Which doesn't exist.
Right.
Maybe there are replications that align to that, but it's knowledge of no one, right?
That's right. That's right.
So I think one of the questions, and precisely, and maybe just to close down on kind of these conceptualizations of what the problem really is, I have to ask you about the figure of the baby, because you have this example where you try to explain where, like, the question is not if there are differences in psychologies or these individual differences, and you have, I think it's the first figure that you have in your book about 3 babies, right, looking at inside their diapers.
Right.
And to be honest, I read it the first time. I was like, yeah, okay, I get it. But then I also saw it in another article that you published, I think in 2013, where you explain it a bit differently. But it's the same. But I was always trying to understand, okay, what's kind of a modern way to explain to me myself this kind of difference. But in that article, and I think in the end also in the book, you say the difference that you could, let's say, observe in these kind of things are indeed data sets
That's right.
themselves in the data, because you are collecting, you have aggregated data, and there, of course, differences arise between individuals, right?
Correct.
But that doesn't mean that those differences, as they are defined or conceptualized, exist necessarily in the individual. So you have this figure of babies, and you talk about sex differences, right, or gender, or what one could say. Can you explain a bit about that? How do you come up? Where did you find this, first of all?
I don't know where I first found the cartoon. I honestly don't. And it was a bit of a problem in using it, because when I first used it, I had to search around, for permission.
Okay, but I mean, I will be happy to know that at least you didn't think of it, right?
No, I didn't think of it. I saw it, and the notions were already in my head. Yeah. And then I said, I can use that.
Yeah, that's the process I was curious about. How does someone sees this? It's just like, this is what I was looking for. This is the example to make my point.
Yeah, that's right.
Which makes it perfectly. That's what was so surprising.
Oh, that's good. I'm pleased. And the publisher finally allowed me to use it on the grounds that, as best it could be told, it had now become part of the public domain. Nobody knew who the original creator was, the cartoon. And I was warned that if I used it and somebody raised an issue about it, I would be financially liable for it. But I was confident that I could use it, partly because I had used it previously in that journal article. Yeah, we can speak meaningfully about, say, sex differences, but sex differences between people. But no one has a sex difference. No, I don't have a skin color difference. I am at least what is called white.
Yes.
It's not different. And the black gentleman sitting next to me, his skin is black. It's not different. There is a difference that can be seen by an onlooker to us both, for example, you, and you can talk about a difference that you see, but that difference is not part of any one of the individuals who is differentiated from the others. This was partly the insight into William Stern's distinction between study of individual differences, variables, and studies of individuals. I'm tempted, I'm going to use it at some point, the phrase in a place where it's prominently displayed. It will jar people. It's the claim, no one is different. No one this isn't different.
Right.
And this guy isn't different either.
Yeah.
And we say, well, which one of you is different? The answer is no one. Do you see?
Yeah. And I think what this also made me think of when you were putting these examples, because I think you have multiple examples about, so the reader of this book really gets the idea of where the conceptual difference and the substantial difference about the epistemology and knowledge and what you can really find out, let's say, as a scientist, etc. There is a clear difference. But what it made me remember, I remember I had a teacher, a professor also once, and she was talking about psychometrics basically, and a test, applying a test. And as I told you, this was in the sports psychology field. So in that field, it's also very important to identify variables, that influence somebody's performance, etc. But I remember she very, very distinguishedly said to the class, she said, well, when you really want to know about the person, what's going on with the person, you don't really need to think about the attributes that are measured. And I think you have a good idea that maybe measurement is not the right concept always. I think you mentioned in a note numerical representation, right?
Right.
But what this professor said during this lesson was, if I want to know what's going on with this person, with this individual, I have to look at the item, at the response. So if I ask them, okay, how do you feel, 0 to 10? Well, to really know what this person tried to reflect on their response, it's easier to just look at the question, look at where they put their answer, and try to understand, okay, this is what this person is telling me. And it's not that necessary to sum up, compare, to go deeper if you really want to know a direct account. So so I think this also brought back to me, like, really the training, the instinct that you are sometimes giving as a psychologist, where they tell you, no, you have to do measurements and you have to do this and that to really know. When in reality, once you get data from an individual, you already know something about them, right? And if you did it more times, and if you did it systematically, and you develop methods for it, then, as you told us, then you can generate maybe some laws that could apply to everybody, be
Quite
stable
possibly.
or same situation. So it's
quite possibly. There's not, at least I don't see anything in principle that would prevent doing that. Right. And I think that that's that's the path that Wundt and Ebbinghaus and the other pioneers wanted to set the discipline on. Stern comes along and says, well, that's not a very good path for studying individuality, because since the early experimentalists were concerned only with establishing what is true in general, signs of individuality in the conduct of experiments would not have been of interest to them. And so what Stern was saying is, when he talked about individuality as being the problem of the 20th century, which he did in the 1900 book, it's the very first line in the foreword, he meant, as I wrote, the challenge for psychology in the 20th century, not to overthrow or reject the Wundtian approach, but to expand psychology in such a way as to accommodate the facts of individuality. Not everything that that goes into the determination of your behavior, your thoughts, your speech, etc., is allgemein. Not everything. Some of it, yeah, but not all of it. And we have to figure out, Stern, we have to figure out ways of accommodating the facts of individuality within a general psychology, and make sure that those can be reconciled with the two. And I think he was right. I think he is right, or at least I have no good reason to argue that he was wrong.
But and now, I mean, that also struck me because he called it the challenge of the 20th century, right?
Right. Yeah.
How
And
did
here
we
we
do?
are.
How did we do? On what was the conclusion? Because it seems that we are still stuck solving that challenge. Is that how you feel?
Yes. And well, I think that the psychology went off the rail when it embraced statistics. And effectively, the challenge that Stern saw was simply abandoned. When we stopped doing experimental psychology in the Wundtian Ebbinghaus way, that challenge disappeared.
Yeah.
And so Anne Anastasi wrote in her textbook, and I think I quoted it in my book, that the knowledge objectives of the differential psychology and the general psychology were basically the same. Stern knew very well they were not. They were not the same. And but the belief that they were the same, and the same in what respect? The same in the respect that differential psychology supplies us with knowledge about individuals no less than did the general experimental psychology. This is something that Stern knew was not the case, and the confusions about which we've spoken previously led to obscuring that fact. And when that fact was obscured, the struggle to meet the challenge that Stern had posed simply disappeared.
Right. And now, I mean, that's. I think there are two things to highlight here. Is that, I mean, I think during our conversation, we have also been very still. We're not digging deep in what you put in your book about the historical developments that led to this, because you mentioned, like I said, big names, let's say recognized psychologists and a lot of people that were commenting on this issue, and that's a whole story by itself, right? And for now, I would also like to maybe close down this topic about we're talking about the methods themselves, because I also sent you part of the questions that were, okay, what do you think, let's say randomized controlled trials, right? This is the kind of the golden standard, which when I read that, I thought, okay, but I know that it's also already a kind of, not buzzword, but like a common concept that, okay, our RCTs are not as golden standard as we thought. I mean, they are still everywhere. They're still, I think, leading grants or whatever projects, etc. But one already starts to hear that idea. But one, by reading your book, one wonders, okay, is this actual change, or is this just blah 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 of the model of science? You know, what do you think is the kind of the current status of RCTs? And I think you also link it to, of course, evidence-based medicine. You know.
Say again the question, Roberto. I'm not.
That what is your general kind of perspective on what randomized controlled trials or movements like evidence-based medicine offer, let's say, to advanced psychology?
It can offer population-level knowledge when the studies are done well. And there's nothing in my book that critiques the methodology of the studies. I'm talking about the conception of them. When the studies are done well, let's say the studies are done as best that they can be done, it offers knowledge, population-level knowledge, about the effectiveness of different interventions or treatments. And I see nothing especially problematic about offering that knowledge to healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, and to patients in the healthcare system. We've done this study, and it looks as if a larger proportion of the treated population gets well or improves, whatever the criterion is, by this treatment method than by this one. I don't see anything wrong with that. Where I was having trouble was with the idea that the findings of randomized control research should be used to limit the treatment options that patients would have and serve to limit the forms of treatment that insurance companies will remunerate. And the argument that they should do so is that, well, we know that the probability that Smith will get better is thus and so with this treatment and thus and so lower with that other treatment. That's the same problem we were talking about. No, sir, you do not know that. This patient may or may not get better with this treatment. And you don't know what the probability is. And therefore, it seems to me that it is ethically problematic to institute, or would be ethically problematic if restrictions were instituted limiting the treatment options that patients would have and the forms of treatment that would be remunerated by insurance companies. Show them the data, then let them make their own decision unrestricted. And that's what I was
Right.
writing about. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. I mean, this is one of the chapters in the book, and I
That's right.
was especially, I think, I would say another main example you use, which in my opinion is probably way more common, or not maybe way more common, but maybe more recognizable by a few people, is the one that you mentioned with the fictional character of Leslie, which I think sometimes you name differently in other publications. I think it doesn't matter. It's not a real person, but the situation is very real, right? That I think it's quite common that psychologists or people working in industry, let's say in business, for recruiting processes or selection processes, use a lot of, or use, one will even say ideally, but maybe not, statistical tests, questionnaires that are said to be based on science and that are said to inform decisions. But sometimes it seems to be that in these kind of situations, the same mistake is made, right? Where somebody takes this kind of test and based on knowledge that has been generated on groups of individuals, makes a claim of knowledge to decide if they give a job to an individual.
Right. That's right. And I see it as an ethical problem. And
right.
It's one thing to say, well, psychologists, psychometricians have not generally understood some of these points in the past. Okay, everybody makes mistakes. But when the correctives get repeated over and over and over again, and they still get ignored, I think there comes a time when we have to say of the practitioners of such methods that they're not making mistakes, they're lying. Now that sounds harsh, but if you present me with an argument that I'm mistaken in some way, and I can't refute it, but I go on treating people the way in which you have challenged, and telling patients, yeah, we know the probability that you're going to get better or that you're going to cause a problem on the job, even though you've been told time and time again, no, you don't know that. And you haven't refuted that argument. That, is there not a point where one says you're not just making repeated mistakes, you're perpetrating a lie?
Right.
That sounds harsh, but I think that, and I don't say that in my book, as you know, but I think that's the place where the argument eventually leads.
I was just thinking with what you were saying that, yeah, it's true. You don't make that strong argument of, okay, psychologists are lying. You don't say that. But what you do say, and I think that's what you provide the evidence for, is that you call psychology as a field, it has proved to be incorrigible, right? It has refused to learn, even when they have, or we have been shown evidence of this or that. It seems to be that there's some kind of resistance or ignorance that is very, very attached.
Yeah. You know, when I originally proposed the book, I proposed to title it Incorrigible Science.
One has the feeling that that was what you wanted to do. That's what I meant. That second part of the title, persistent dismissal of its critics. I was like, hey, there's probably a word that says that.
Right. I wanted to, and the publisher said no. And why? They said their marketing research shows that when you title a book, you have to tell the reader immediately and unambiguously what the book is about. And they said, if you use the title Incorrigible Science, it'll be more difficult to market the book. When you said early today in our interview that you had come across this book and you saw the title, it caught you right away. I'm thinking, geez, my publishers were right. Would it have caught you? Well, the publisher said also, they said, a lot of people who might come across this book may not even know what the word incorrigible means. Okay. And I think they were right. Not that I've sold great volumes of the book in any case, but I was struck when you said that you found the title. As soon as you saw it,
was an eye catcher.
Yes. And so I didn't come up with that title. My publishers did, and I was a little bit disappointed, but I think they were right.
Yeah. I mean, I guess they were able to probabilistically know things about me.
Well, that's right.
So that was the second part of my conversation with Professor James Lamiell. I hope you enjoyed also as much as I have done with these 3-part conversations that I had with him. If you want to hear the uncut version of our discussions, you can find that in my podcast. And like I said before, if you want to read about it or read more about my thoughts about this topic, you can find that in my blog. And of course, you still have one more part of the conversation to go, so you can also find that video in the description. And as usual, if you have any thoughts about what this book is about, what Professor Lamiell is saying, I really would like to know what you're thinking. So please put that in the comments, and remember, you can help me by giving a like to the video, subscribing to the channel, following me on social media. Just let me know if what you think of this content, or if you would like to hear more specific things about psychology or behavioral science. I will be happy to work on that. So as usual, thank you for watching this video, and see you soon.